Hello and welcome to my presentation. As you all have probably seen from clicking on this video, I will be presenting on my project termed A Social Reproductive Ontology of Class. Just to give you a sort of outline of the project I will be giving you, in addition to the abstract you've probably read, my thesis is that I will be proposing an ontological account of class, specifically to be conceived of as an organic process. The way I will be going about this is that I will first offer a partial map of the argumentative space on which different conceptions of social class in this ontology have been argued. I will list a couple of inciting issues with a prominent process view of class given by Ellen Wood. I will supply an alternative process view, specifically within the context of social reproduction theory, and I will supplement a ontological ambiguity within social reproduction theory, such that I will attempt to rectify that view and relate that back to Wood to close out my argument. So first we would want to ask, what exactly is social class ontologically? What would be the kinds of answers to a question like this? A prominent way of sort of posing this opposition is to say that social class is either a location in social structures, which is often sort of derided in a sort of negative evaluation as the kind of default or main way of saying what class is within sociology. I will not be sort of defending that view, but I will note that this is a gross simplification of how class is talked about in sociology. What I am more concerned with is addressing the ambiguity of the answer of social class as a process. I am primarily taking this framing from works by Ellen Wood, who frames the dispute over what is social class in these terms, but it's also a general framing that many Marxists take. And so when one says social class is a process, we should of course ask, what kind of process, or what is it a process of? In her account, Ellen Wood seems to pose social class as a process of transformation. Transformation is my term, but what she essentially describes is class as a process is of a class situation being worked over by conscious reflection of people in shared situations, organizing such that they produce a class formation. In her own words, she writes, the conception of class as a relationship in process is directed against definitions which imply that there is one point in the formation of classes where one can stop the process and say, here is class and not before. But the point is not to identify class with a particular level of consciousness or organization, which makes it a conscious political force, but rather to focus our attention on class in the process of becoming or making itself such a force. So this is Wood's claim, that if we're going to think about class, it needs to be this kind of process of social reflection over situations, shared situations into shared political organization. My contention is that we should instead think of class as a process, but a different kind, namely a reproduction process. It is a process of classes as things which manage to persist transgenerationally by definition. Why am I proposing an alternative to Wood's view? Well, one of the issues that one might take is that Wood's framing of class ontologically as a process has a strong reliance on a questionable Marxist philosophy of history narrative. What she's trying to pose with this process language is a coming into, as well as going out of, revolutionary class consciousness. That is the process. Yet one might wonder, well, class is a social term that we share with Plato and Aristotle in some sense. It's a phenomenon much older than the classical English proletariat of the 1800s, which is being used to frame this conception of what is class. And so if we want a more transhistorical notion of what is class as a social phenomenon, to too strongly model it on the modern English proletariat would be a mistake. So instead of, say, the classical workers' movement, something like peasants also should be sort of conceptually allowed into our definition. What most motivates me is a kind of open question that seems essential to class as a phenomenon, that it's something that persists despite the flux of individuals. It's not just about an inequality between you and I, but some kind of shared identity or inequality that persists through my progeny and your progeny. It's a transgenerational thing. That's what makes mere inequality into class. So if we want to try and take a pictorial representation of the view that Wood is proposing, it's something like this. Imagine the black dot in the middle moving back and forth between, on the one hand, class in itself, or class as an unconscious fact of a social situation, sometimes proceeding farther towards the right into class for itself, or as politicized organization in consciousness of a social situation. When Wood is saying that class is a process, she's saying it is a movement back and forth between these two poles along a sort of paradigm. My intervention is to take the exact same basic idea and then take this sort of central dot and turn it into itself a circular process. In order to sort of center the question, how is the persistence of class maintained over time at any particular point along Wood's process of more or less politicized or consciousness of class as a social situation? So what do I mean by sort of introducing this language of a reproductive process? Well, I'm introducing it in order to try and explain class has in sort of internal to the idea a stability of identity in spite of historical change. It's not just about you and me, but it is a shared identity that continues through further generations. It's a kind of transgenerational essence to what it means for something to be class. It is also, in a sense, a kind of doubled process. There's a stable reproduction of identity as a process, which has to serve as a necessary background against which Wood's account of class becoming politicized would make sense. So Wood develops an account that I think is very good for trying to explain novelty, or the revolutionary break of people recognizing a shared situation and coming to become self-conscious social agents that might sort of change a social body. My sort of addendum is just to go, well, first we must explain the dull grind of class as a normal aspect of society, which then can experience some sort of novelty or revolutionary break. My proposal for thinking about this reproductive process is the idea of process contained in the model of the organism, which is as a flow of constant interactions of constitutive parts of some kind of organic whole, which maintains a stable identity through its interactions with an external environment. So, of course, you might want to be asking at this point, okay, organic process, let's add into the account, but how should this actually be thought in concrete terms? My answer is social reproduction theory, but with addenda. So what is social reproduction theory? It can be encapsulated by roughly three main claims that lead from one to the other. First, it sort of begins from a point of a critique of classical Marxist economy, political economy, which is just that in its accounting of capitalist economic processes, the reproduction of labor, of capital through various circuits, there has been an ignorance of the reproduction of labor power as not just a sort of natural posit of, oh, humans as natural creatures continue to, have babies, have future workers, but instead the consumption practices and the qualitative nature in which people make further people, which can then go work in factories or work on fields, et cetera, that needs to be considered as internal to economic processes. This first figure I have here is from a work by Michael Leibowitz, who does a lot of the sort of internal critique of Marx's work in Capital to show that Marx sets up these kinds of topics, but never followed through in his finished writings. This critique of sort of ignorance of the reproduction of labor power leads to a feminist rejection of class reductionism. The basic claim being that the home and civic space activities, which are often deeply characterized by gender and racial divisions, are precisely those processes of labor reproduction. The eating, cooking, cleaning, raising children, socialization, recreation, just the way of interacting with people that gives you enough energy to go through another day of working or to raise further people to replace you in your old age in the factory. These are all deeply complicated and qualitatively diverse aspects of capitalist political economy. And I would also say political economy in general. And this finally leads to the third main claim, which is sort of SRT's main claim of praxis, which is that forms of mutual aid in the struggle over social reproduction resources are constitutive of most forms of historic class struggle, rather than just merely workplace disputes over wages and such. The sort of popular example in much of the literature is Black Panther free breakfast program, which sort of binds a community together and helps people get through another day. These things are sort of necessary to radical and socially contestatory social movements. The issue, however, that I want to amend in social reproduction theory is that as a study of reproductive relations, such as in the political economy of racialized housework, there is an ambiguity on the ontology of what exactly these reproductive relations that are described by SRT are. Kind of leads to a meta question. Should we be asking what is being reproduced or what is reproducing? Is the labor power or the worker as a qualitatively complex being reproduced in a passive sense, or is actively reproducing themselves as a coherent being? In other words, the critical ambiguity is the social reproduction of a class akin, following the organism metaphor I've introduced, to the reproduction of an organ as something that is subsumed to some larger whole, i.e. class society, or is itself an organism, reproduces itself self-sufficiently, self-interestedly, and not subsumed to some larger whole. So it's the choice between being an organ or being a Vitruvian man. This is not a critique that I am novel in pointing out. Federico Brigado and R.V. Sekela have already sort of pointed out that in the most ambitious formulations of SRT, almost everything seems to be called socially contestatory social reproduction. However, it seems if the reproduction of workers is supposed to be somehow essential to the goings-on of capitalism, but is also socially resistant, when is a sort of activity of helping people get by another day some form of like anti-capitalist solidarity, or is just simply part of capitalism continuing to go on? It seems there's a confused ontology of reproduction at the heart of SRT. Not everything that might be called mutual aid is resistance, but what is the deciding factor? Is the migrant laborers who, in forms of solidarity, keep each other continuing to work another day on the fields, just simply reproducing the unjust hierarchies of capitalist farming by continuing to provide labor to the farms, or are they in some ways sort of challenging the system? My suggestion for trying to address this ambiguity is to seek out some help from the philosophy of biology. It seems as if reproduction is some kind of circular causality being involved. There is a kind of circular motion of some vague kind going on. The problem is that there are all kinds of processes which are self-causing, but in different ways. And thus, the philosophers of biology have distinguished between different kinds of circular causal regimes, because they're deeply interested in being able to distinguish the circular causal regimes that we would call a living system, like a biological organism, and things that are circular causal, but aren't living things. This is needed because they want to justify or argue against teleological ascriptions, or being able to say that something serves a function. One particular organ of your body can be accurately described as being functional in the context of a larger self-preserving system called your body. One approach within these debates is the organizational approach, which describes life as a self-determining, self-reproductive process. So what does this mean? Well, not all causal circularity is self-determining. For example, a candle flame is circularly causal because the burning of the flame, the maintaining of some kind of pattern, is self-causing. It burns, it melts the wax, thus causing the fueling of fuel into the fire so it can continue to go on. The distinguishing of the circular causality of a living being from a candle flame is distinguished through the combination of two combined traits, according to the organizational approach. These are organizational closure and differentiation. Closure is what I just described in the case of the candle flame. The structure of the entity is itself a necessary condition for its continued existence over time. This is a characteristic shared by both the candle and you as a human being. Organizational differentiation is where they split. Differentiation is a system being complex or being made of several constitutive parts. It is a whole made of various parts where the reproduction of the whole produces its internal functional components, i.e., your body and its interaction with some kind of environment cycles energy and matter from that environment to reproduce the cells of your liver. However, the candle in its circular causality does not self-reproduce the wick and the wax in its burning. So what is the point that I'm trying to get at here? It is that a recognized consequence of this organizational approach in defining of living circular causal systems is that systems other than individual organisms can be understood as living systems with these various sorts of properties. For example, the one most recognized in this literature is that a transgenerational lineage can be plausibly said to demonstrate closure and differentiation, and thus would count as an intrinsically teleological system, which has functional components that can be described as such. We can recognize the sort of transhistorical, singularly identical system that reproduces through various organic individuals by pointing to your reproductive organs. In your going through a typical lifetime, your reproductive organs are not in fact functional for you, but they are functional for the singularly identical transgenerational system that you are a component of in its reproduction through time. So in essence, if the essence of class following SRT analysis is that primarily the social activities of production and consumption practices are that which reproduce a cohort of individuals over time, then these are functional in the maintenance of an underlying identity, which can be plausibly described with this biological language. Class is a transgenerational system of distinct cooperative acts which preserve a group of people in roughly the same way over time. So this would have us, we have one further ambiguity to address. Is it that it's class society which demonstrates a kind of self-determination, or is it that an individual class in its reproduction demonstrates self-determination? This is where I add one final addendum through cybernetics, because it seems as if cells, organs, individuals, species all seem to exhibit something like closure and differentiation, but they're all sort of nested in various levels of distinctions. How do we determine whether class is a reproductive part or a reproductive whole? Well, I sort of suggest the terms from cybernetics, namely variety and viability. In simple terms, one can quantify the degree of control a system can exert over itself in terms of variety, namely the number of states it can induce in itself. Variety can also be used to describe the number of states the environment might impose upon some kind of system. And finally, a system will only be viable in its self-reproduction if it has equal or greater variety than its environment. So in simple terms, if you as a system, if you are faced by some kind of environment which can impact you in three distinct kinds of ways or three states, in order to be capable of navigating that environment in a self-determining way, you will need to have at least three possible states or modes of response in order to interact with your environment in a sufficiently stabilizing way. My claim is, taking up this language, the satisfaction of a class's social reproductive needs via complex forms of organization that are internal to it are the determining factor in whether the organization of mutual aid will be socially resistant and sort of preserving of people as self-determining sort of collective cohort, or will be reproductive of the general society as a whole. These terms of variety and viability are leading us to make kinds of empirical questions like, does any cohort of individuals in their reproduction over time demonstrate a coherence equal to or greater than that of the overall society? Being able to plausibly answer these questions will allow us to determine whether workers sort of in their social reproductive needs and how they respond to those are demonstrating and achieving a form of self-determination as a collective organic body, thereby enabling acts of protest or social contestation with the environment of their general class society, and thus achieving Wood's revolutionary kind of image. Or if they don't achieve that, then in their reproduction, they're merely reproducing the general class society. So this leads me to my conclusion, which might sound relatively obvious given what we've said so far. The more social reproduction is organized in a self-determining fashion, the more the logic of class reproduction will be akin to a cancer, i.e., it operates as a self-determining, self-reproducing body within some larger body, thus threatening the sort of uber body through its continued maintenance. It can sort of neglect the needs or dictates of the whole, given its self-interestedness. The manner in which social reproduction of a class over time is managed in these terms will determine whether it's reproduced more towards, say, roughly the left side of Woods's process, more of class reproduced as an organ, as in itself, or in forms of mutual aid as class society stabilizing, or more towards the right of class reproduced as an organism, as a class for itself, or in its mutual aid becoming class destabilizing. This is where I must end my presentation, given time limits. I look forward to addressing certain concerns, questions, or being able to answer certain clarifications via both the online discussion board and through the live Q&A later. So thank you for watching. And let me show you just briefly my references.